So it's Friday, we made it. Welcome back to Culture Launch. I'm here with Parker Gale principals Paul Stansik and Jimmy Holloran to talk through how investors perceive culture and how they can use it as a leading indicator of portfolio company success. But before we jump in, some housekeeping items. In the spirit of full transparency, CultureIQ is a portfolio company of Parker Gale's, and CultureIQ sponsors this Culture Launch session today. So with that, Paul, do you want to kick us off and tell us a little bit about your background and, your life story that led you to this moment?
Yeah, I'll keep it to under 45 minutes if I can. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Paul Stansik. Like Shannon mentioned, I'm a principal on the operations team here at Parker Gale Capital. Been with Parker Gale for about 2 years at this point. Before that, had a long and winding and random road with a bunch of other jobs, strategy consultant, sales manager, washed up lacrosse player, and now with the gentleman below me, at least on my screen, I now co-run the talent practice with Jimmy here at Parker Gale. So just as an introduction, if you haven't heard of us, we're a smaller technology-focused PE fund based out of Chicago, although all of us are scattered due to the pandemic going on right now. And we buy one thing, founder-owned B2B technology companies. And that's where the fun starts for Jimmy and I. So I'll let him introduce himself and talk a little bit about what that looks like. But he and I focus on everything talent related and people related inside of our portfolio. So that means everything from working with our C-suite executives all the way down to delivering learning and development programs that Jimmy is so awesome at constructing and rolling out. So I'll let him talk a little bit more about that, but we're excited to be here. And that's a little bit about what I do.
Yeah, Paul and I have bounced around. So I've been with Parker Gale 2 years as well. We were hired around the same time to run the talent practice. I spent time in telecom sales as a sixth grade math teacher. Paul and I overlapped at Bain & Company. We did the strategy consulting thing. I spent some time at a VC-backed startup, Home Chef, that was acquired by Kroger. And yeah, what we do inside Parker Gale is make good. If you go to the Parker Gale website, it says products that matter, cultures that last. And Paul and I our job is to make good on the second part of that, creating cultures that last. And what's great, we are both investors in CultureIQ, but I guess full disclosure, we are customers of CultureIQ, and I am a client, so to speak, of you all, and I work really closely with your strategist team, and we use CultureIQ to measure how we're doing, and we find the tool very helpful in helping us improve our cultures and really make good on that promise to create cultures that last. So yeah, excited to be here.
Brilliant, awesome wrap up there. So I always like to ask this first baseline question to kick everything off. So a lot of people define culture differently. So I'd like to know how you as an investor, but also you as Parker Gale, define culture or perceive culture.
Yeah, Jimmy, fill in the blanks for me on this one. I mean, there's a lot of good management thinkers out there that are defining culture in different ways. I like to direct people towards one of my favorites, Miss Dolly Parton. She has a great quote. It's, you want to find out who you are and then do it on purpose. So to me, culture is a very real and live thing. Like, you can see it, you can observe it, you can videotape it, and it's grounded in what's already good and unique and already going on inside of your company. So sometimes it's helpful to frame this as like, what is culture not? Culture is not perks. Culture is not the ping pong table in the break room of your office. Some of us are probably missing that right now. It's not the keg of cold brew in your WeWork co-working space. It's not these big aspirational things that you hope to be someday. We like to talk about it with our leadership teams as it's pretty synonymous with your core values, right? It's the things that are true about your best people most of the time. And so where I see people kind of, misuse the word culture or find themselves struggling with how do we actually start working on this, is it's a bit of a definitional problem, and they often miss the point that they need to look inward and figure out what's good and unique about their company before they get started doing this kind of work. So I don't know. Yeah. Again, I'm from the Dolly Parton school of cultural thought, but Jimmy can add to that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's the routines, the practices, like it's how we do things around here. My heuristic that I'll use with CEOs is, you take Paul. What did you say? It's how your best folks operate most of the time.
Yep.
If as a CEO or an executive or a leader of a company, you were able to sit in on a conversation at a bar with two of your higher performers, how are they talking about the company? That's what your culture is. Strip away everything on the website. That's what it is. And if it's related to what's on your website and the core values, terrific. You're doing a great job. If it's not, that's still your culture, right? Your culture is however folks talk about your organization.
Yeah, I think Peter Thiel has a quote. It's like, I'm going to botch this, but like, no company has a culture. Every company is a culture.
Sure.
Right. So it's the amalgamation of everything that goes on, the standards, the practices, the behaviors, and kind of like Jimmy said, it's kind of what goes on when the formal business processes aren't running. It's these moments of truth. You could either go this way or this way. Where are you kind of naturally grooved to go as an organization? That's kind of how we think about it.
Right. And I think something we see often and have to kind of articulate is you have a culture whether you like it or not, and whether you're paying attention to it or not. So you might as well try to manage it and leverage it to get those behaviors that are going to drive towards your overall strategy.
And be intentional about it, right? I mean, this is a lot of what Jimmy works on with our management cohorts inside of our portfolio, but you're going to have one whether you work on this or not, right? So you might as well use it as a force for good. And again, I think that starts with introspection. It starts with examining what's already good and unique and potentially a source of competitive advantage for your company, and trying to harness that in some way, whether it's, hey, we feel like we have a bit of a advantage from our culture, some aspect of our people. How do we turn that from an advantage into a superpower? Or if you look inward and you realize like, hey, we actually have some gaps here, it's shoring up those gaps before you start to kind of launch into hypergrowth mode. So I think there's two ways to look at it. But again, it does start with some introspection. It does start with taking stock of what your best people are doing and using that as a bit of a standard that you want to hold the rest of the company to.
Absolutely. And on the topic of harnessing it for some good, right? So what are some of the techniques that you guys are implementing either within Parker Gale or across the portfolio on how to really leverage your culture towards your overall business strategy?
Jimmy, you want to talk about L6 now or later?
Exactly. One of the things that, and this may be a question early on, so if I'm ruining the spoiler alert, that the culture and leadership are very much two sides of the same coin. And you can't have a strong company culture without a set of leaders, both at the executive level and the level below. We invest in kind of mid-market companies, so there's between 100 and 200 employees. So we're talking about a couple layers of leadership. If you don't have leaders setting the weather, setting an example, living by those values most of the time, you can't actually build a strong culture. So one of the things we do is we invest in those leaders with a really robust leadership program called L6. That it's 6 months, it's 6 full-day on-sites. Each member of the program has an executive coach through it. They each do a leadership circle profile. And we talk a lot about the important, we're trying to build communities of evolved, mindful, and skillful leaders. Mindful being those that are conscious of your actions every day. Skillful being you can actually deploy management practices. And evolved meaning you're leaning into creativity and you're able to manage in uncertainty. And we're able to see impact in our CultureIQ scores after managers and directors and executives go through this program, because the way I kind of imagine a company is it's a series of collisions of individuals or groups. And the quality of those collisions and interactions is what moves a culture in a positive direction and a negative direction. And if you have leaders who are evolved, mindful, skillful, who are attuned to what's going on in individuals' lives, what's going on in the company. It gradually migrates and pulls in a positive direction. The kind of the feeling inside the company, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, leadership and culture go hand in hand, and we think you can't have really great culture without really strong leadership at all levels of the organization. So that's why we invest really heavily in our leadership development program.
Yeah, and Jimmy's the one who owns this program. He's the architect, but from the outside in, watching it be deployed and watching it, how it affects different areas of the company, leadership, all the way to frontline employees, it's pretty amazing. And I think it's effective for a couple of reasons. One, it gives folks in that management cohort the permission to engage in behavior that often they see as just C-suite behavior, right? Which is kind of setting this weather. Yeah. It's reminding people of what the culture is and isn't about. It's holding people accountable to, what we call like the limits of diversity, like the things that you're saying yes to and no to about your organization. And it trains them in the skills and the techniques and the like managerial ninjutsu you need to know to do that effectively for the folks on your team. But I think some people miss the step of giving people the explicit permission, because without that, the stuff that's hard, in some cases, the stuff that's soft, like the soft skills, Jimmy likes to say the soft skills are just really hard skills.
Yeah.
If you don't give people that explicit permission to go there, to be people that are reinforcing that culture for you, they're not going to do it because it's foreign, it's a little bit scary, and oftentimes they haven't been trained in the skills and the communication techniques that you can use to effectively go there.
Yeah. Yeah, and what do we find when we invest in leaders? And I'm going to steal a little bit from the CultureIQ framework. I mean, we see a stronger connection to company purpose, which the executive team is really key in setting the purpose, but then it's the responsibility of the middle of the company to cascade that purpose, in treating folks with dignity so that everyone can bring their full self to work and know that they're being seen. And it's amazing how much that middle layer fosters collaboration across the organization. So often, one side, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. And all these things equate to creating an agile workforce. Because, I mean, one thing that we know is true, having lived through 2020, is that the only thing that is stable is instability. And leaders, and then layer on top of that, in our case, investors who have high expectations and 100-day plans and all the things that come with being part of a private equity owned business, you have to have really sound, and again, going back to our evolved, mindful, and skillful leadership to be able to grow, to grow the culture and ultimately grow the business.
Yeah, and I think, there's some really, really good thinking about how do you build a strong culture. Like, I think you have to be careful with the idea of a strong culture, because every company is a culture, every company is unique, and I think you do need to be intentional about where you're at, what you're trying to build, and how that links to what you're trying to do from a business standpoint. But there's a guy named Gale. I think Elad was an early investor in Twitter. He wrote a great book called The High Growth Handbook, and he has a whole chapter on this. It's usefully marked how to build a strong culture, and I love the 4 steps that he uses. Step 1 is have strong hiring filters in place. So we focus a lot on that in our portfolio. We run an initiative that focuses on, hey, let's make the case for why hiring matters. Let's connect it to what we're trying to build culturally, and let's train our managers on how to decide who's in and who's out, who gets to be a part of that journey, and who's going to be accretive to that culture. So that's step number 1, is the hiring filters. Step number 2, which I think plays into a lot of what Jimmy mentioned with L6, is you need to constantly emphasize those values day to day. So we work with the Table Group with our leadership teams. If you've heard of Pat Lencioni or the concepts of organizational health, he's the author and the architect behind all of that. One of the disciplines he espouses is just over communicating and reinforcing, finding all of the little pockets and the opportunities to build in what you want your culture to be and what the best of it is. You need to take advantage of those. So whether that's building it into a program like L6 that teaches folks how to use this in their day-to-day conversations with their teams, or building it into your hiring process, your performance management process, whatever else, it's just kind of looking around and having that radar and saying, which of our business processes reflects our culture and what we want that to be? Where are we screening for these things, or where are we just kind of letting things happen? So that step number 2, constantly emphasizing, I think is super important and easy to miss. The third one is thinking about incentives, right? You want to think about how people are rewarded, and performance matters, but it can't just be about performance. Like, you want to reward people both for performance as well as adherence to and accretiveness to the culture. There's lots of different ways to do that, but just creating a dialogue around compensation and say, hey, what signal are we sending in the way that we reward people? And is that kind of in line with the culture we want to build? And then 4, Dan Coyle, Culture Code, one of Jimmy and I's favorite authors ever, he says, it's about the signals that you send, right? So what kind of signals are you sending about the organization that you're building, the journey that you're on? One of the most important and loud signals that you can send is who's in and who's out, right? Yeah. So it's not just about hiring the right people. Sometimes it's about getting rid of people who are bad culture fits and who are actively taking away from the environment that you're trying to build inside of your company. So, if you're looking for a place to start, I think you need to measure it. I think you need an objective handle on what your culture looks like, right? But once you have that, once you have a sense of where you're at and where you want to go, strong hiring filters, emphasizing the values, rewarding people based on a balance of things and including culture in that, and getting rid of the people who just need something with different cultural constraints. It's pretty hard to go wrong if you can honestly look in the mirror and saying you're doing all 4 of those.
Now, on the topic, so you bring up a good point in terms of hiring and culture fit, and something I get a lot is it's hard to get leadership buy-in for culture, right? So A, how do you guys make sure you're bringing in leaders that have this same perspective? B, maybe you're not and you're articulating the value. But C, why do you think this is still happening? Why is there still a lack of leadership buy-in on culture? You talk to leaders every day, so.
Yeah.
I'll start, and then Paul, you pick. It's not like there is some education that happens. One of the primary drivers of investment return in the private equity world is alignment between the deal partner, whoever the kind of the chairman of the board is, so to speak, whoever's owning the deal from the partner side, the CEO of the business, the executive team, and then down to the management team. And part of it in the investing world means that the investors need to be bought into spending on the cultural side, right? Because the investors are the one approving the P&L and where funds are going. And if it's the type of investment firm that is maybe looking short term or isn't bought in, it's going to be really hard for even a CEO that really gets it to make that investment, because those would be the types of questions that come up in the annual budget meeting and may get cut. So there does need to be alignment early on, and not just like the CEO of the business, but the investors in the private equity world. And I like for me, when I talk about it, we talk a lot about the long run, and like what we invest in founder-owned software businesses. What is a software business other than some real estate, which we don't even go to anymore because we're all at home, the code, and the people that write and sell the code. That's it, right? So if you're going to invest in something for the long run, you better invest in the people. So I kind of start there. And we have the luxury at Parker Gale is having a full backing of the, I mean, Paul and I have a job because the partners at Parker Gale value this stuff. So I would say we have an easier time than say others, because CEOs are kind of like, well, of course I want to invest in my people. But yeah, when you don't have that initial buy-in, it's really tough. Paul, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, if going back to what Pat Lencioni would say, like, I think a lot of people still believe it's honestly beneath them.
Yeah.
Which is a shame, right? Because I do believe the costs, the measurable financial costs of getting this wrong can be pretty meaningful. Like if you get this wrong, whether it's through inattention or just going about it the wrong way, and not just, you're having a employee engagement issue or people are in open revolt in your company, like that can happen, but just merely not focusing on this, Like, hey, is wasted time valuable to you? Is decreased productivity valuable to you? Is increased employee turnover valuable to you? Like, how about customer attrition? Does that matter to you? I'm not saying like it's an if then that's going to happen right away if you take your eye off the ball. But, you know, Shannon, to your question about how do you get leaders to buy in? I mean, we have strong hiring filters. Nobody gets to be a leader inside of our portfolio
Yeah.
without, you know, going through a gauntlet of a deep dive, not only into what they've done, but how they think. And we engineer a good portion of that hiring process to focus on, you know, not only how do you do the job, but like, how do you play well with others and what type of culture do you create on your team? And it can be pretty obvious when we ask a few follow-up questions and peel the onion if someone doesn't care about this, doesn't think about it, or doesn't have the experience in doing it the right way. I think the other thing that we do is we really depend on our leaders to weigh in before they buy in on how they're going to talk about their culture. So again, this is not our IP. We're very fortunate to work with the team over at the Table Group, but they've got a fantastic exercise that they've written about. If you Google, you know, the Table Group, rock stars and misfits, it's one of my favorite things. But I think you need to make this a conversation that's grounded in real people on their team that they see every day. Like, who are the folks that if you could clone, if you could create a company of these people, you absolutely would do it. They're great at their jobs, but they're great teammates and they represent what's best about the organization. Let's make that list and let's talk about what's true about those people. And then let's do the inverse. Let's talk about the people who not necessarily are underperforming, but, you know, who's holding us back? Who's a complicator instead of a simplifier? Who needs that additional coaching and it just isn't sticking? And what's true about those people? And one, that's a really energizing conversation to have. It's a great example of how to build vulnerability on a leadership team, because you need to talk about people on other people's teams. And that's a little bit of a scary conversation to have. But what it reveals is, like, of course this matters, because of course we would want more of our best people if we had the chance. So what do we have to do to go and get more of that? Right. So I think the concept of weighing in and buying in and involving that entire leadership team and then cascading it further out inside the organization is super important. But if you don't do anything with that, it doesn't matter. Right. And that goes back to my 4 steps. Like, okay, let's identify what are these factors that really describe and accurately portray our culture. And let's build in filters to make sure that we're hiring for them, we're nudging people towards them in the way that we reward people, and we're also building our performance management to encourage folks that, hey, this is how we do things and this is how we're going to win.
Yeah. The last thing I'll add to that is I mean, we use language really purposefully and with precision when we talk about building culture. Like all of our when we say organizational health, we know what that means. We talk about evolve, mindful, skillful. Everyone knows what that means. Some of the elements of the CultureIQ framework, we know what that means. It's important to have a framework, which again is one of the reasons you know the CultureIQ framework is powerful. Is it gives those who are looking to influence leaders a framework to talk about these nebulous issues, because without a framework, it does seem like fluff, but there is science behind it, there is rigor behind it, but it needs to be consistently discussed and deployed, and language is an important part of that when seeking to influence.
Yeah, it helps you get past that measurement bias, right? Because like we've all seen the trap of the board meeting where the sales leader comes in and their first slide is a slide of a bunch of logos, right? And where my head immediately goes when they pull that up is like, okay, is that good? Is that not good? I don't know, right? You need a tool and a framework that helps you measure things objectively so I can tell how we're doing versus some standard, right? So that the tool matters, and the tool just enables you to have a discussion grounded in data that's a little bit more objective that you can come back to and see, hey, if we do these 4 things that Paul suggests or whatever else is out there, is that working, and how do we see that showing up, not only across the company, but within the individual teams? That's the dialogue you want to have. It's where are we today? What have we done? And how do we see that changing? And if you just have it once, it's not worth anything. That's why I say it's a dialogue. You continually talk about it, and you have a tool that supports that conversation. Otherwise, it's really hard to tell, hey, thumbs up or thumbs down. I'm not really sure, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so another thing we see in the market, and it kind of goes back to the communications, and it goes back to that middle manager concept. So in terms of action planning, right? So we'll define the culture that we have, where we want to go, and then we'll set these action plans based on the data that comes back, right? And then these action plans get implemented by, with sign off from ELT, and then they get trickled down to the different departments or business units, right? And that's kind of where we see the actions fall, like either go away or fall aside. And it's usually because that level of communication or that level of transparency to the bigger picture is lacking in some capacity. So do you guys have any tips or tactics that you could possibly, give to our listeners today on how to decrease that a bit?
Yeah, the thing that I see HR leaders falling into the trap of is kind of you get stalled by consensus on this stuff, right? Like it's really tempting that once you get some results back, however you're measuring your culture, is to go out to the entire employee base and say, hey, what should we do about this? Right? And maybe sometimes that's a good idea. I haven't seen an occasion where that leads to really quick action that's followed through on that actually makes an impact. I think you need to be comfortable being strategic. And Cece, our colleague on the operations team, has this drilled into our skulls, but strategy is about making hard choices, right?
Yeah.
And I think you need to empower your people to make some hard choices and to debate, hey, what are the options for attacking this problem or this opportunity? And let's sort through what those are, and let's figure out if what we're doing is working. So again, I think it comes back to the idea of letting people weigh in before they buy in. I think you have to deputize a subset of your employee base for each of these issues that comes up. You got to be thoughtful in who you choose, but it can't be everybody. The answer can't be another survey. And you have to let them try stuff, and you have to have a feedback loop in place to just ask the question, hey, is this working? Is this not working? Yeah. And if you don't have a tool to measure if it's working, again, you're going to fall into the trap of the logos, right? Like, hey, these logos look really good, but I'm not sure if that's doing better or worse than we were doing before. The same thing's true for culture. So I think it starts with, recognizing, maybe even from those conversations you had about who our best people are, what represents the best of this. Hey, we want to empower you and deputize you to actually add to this culture. Here's what we're seeing in the data. We want you to come back to us with a proposal about the options and what makes more sense. I think what you'll find there is that's incredibly empowering for that group, especially if it's a group that doesn't get called on for these company-wide initiatives. I think you'll see that energizes people, and the ideas that they come back with, there's actually some momentum for follow through, versus if you pulse everybody again, if you get some suggestions and then, well, I answered a survey, but I don't really feel any ownership for the follow through here. So I don't know. I think it starts with having a smaller group that's empowered to do it. And then I think it starts with trusting your people to come back with some good ideas and follow through on them.
Yeah. And the thing I'll add is if what I agree, put more wood behind fewer arrows, which I do think your strategists do an amazing job of cutting through all the noise and here are the storylines, right? Where the client needs to take ownership, the CEO, the executive team, if this is something where, okay, we ran the survey, we're going to do these 2 initiatives, and then the ELT forgets about it until 10 months later, when it's time to do another survey and check on progress. And that's the CEO that wants the window dressing, but is not ready to really commit executive mind share. And it's both, and you need to have Paul referenced the HR leader. You need to have an HR leader who knows how to talk about this and has a seat at the table, who can help own and push this forward and make sure whatever it is that has been deputized to the team is a significant part of the overall agenda. Because if it's just a check the box activity, which ultimately it ends up being because we want to have a good culture and it is fluffy, then it just does get lost in the shuffle, no matter how precise the strategist kind of diagnoses here that do these 2 things. If it isn't on the ELT's radar, on some sort of regular cadence, if there isn't some sort of checkpoint, if they're not willing to put resources behind whatever the change is, invest in it, it's just not going to have staying power.
Yeah, and it needs to be a dialogue. It can't just be one slide in the board deck once a year when the results come back, right? Jimmy's going to laugh because I say this all the time, but back to his point about leadership, like good leaders kind of all do the same thing, right? Yeah. They have standards, they assess against the standards, and they close the gaps. And they're constantly scanning for the little things that are falling behind what they would consider up to code, right? And if
this is not, one thing I'll let you get, like, if the culture stuff if it's not part of the scan, if it's not in the rubric, forget about anything being successful in implementation, right?
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why, I think it can be a huge benefit to get some help on assessing your culture. Like, we're biased, we're recovering strategy consultants, but we think there is value in bringing a third party in to look at things. Yeah. But part of it is just like, what is the framework that you're going to use to assess where you are? Are you going to come up with that? Are you going to look at several different books on this and kind of come up with something proprietary? Like, if you're the HR leader, how believable is that going to be to the rest of the leaders on your team? Like, that's a source of real angst and stress. I think what you're trying to do here more than anything is create a common thread. You're trying to create a standard that shows up often in your conversations as a leadership team so that you can have a consistent, believable dialogue around where are we, what gaps are we trying to address, and are we effectively closing those gaps? And there's always going to be gaps. You're going to measure this once a quarter, or however long you measure it. Things will pop up. But I think the important part is that discipline around, like, okay, what are we measuring against? What are we seeing? And then what are the actions that we're actually taking where we're empowering our people to close those gaps that we're seeing?
Couldn't agree more. And I think like you said, there's a couple common themes I'm hearing, one being consistency, right? And that common thread. And you had mentioned feedback loops, right? I think it's one thing to have a consistent survey schedule, but it's another thing to actually be giving consistent feedback to your teams and your company as a whole. What are some ways to remove friction in terms of like giving feedback to your team, or maybe just, cultural behaviors? Like, how do you make that a norm?
Jimmy, I think you should talk about common language.
Yeah. It's honestly less about magic and more about discipline. Yeah, if you have a set of agreed upon standards and you have your values or your expectations and you're clear about those, and each member of the ELT and the CEOs like use the same language to either reward, give praise for positive activity or provide words of encouragement for areas of growth and critical feedback when necessary. If that's not happening at the top, then it's not going to happen further down. And I'm not quite sure why they're like, again, there isn't a rubric for it per se. I mean, it's kind of this framework's been weaponized with the Kim Scott radical framework, radical candor framework, the care. It's not care deeply. It's care personally and challenge directly. It's just not all that hard to give direct feedback after you've demonstrated that you care about the individual, and people just kind of need to do it. Now, I'll backtrack. I can say one of the things we invest in are like the emotional intelligence skills and like the language skills, and we in our leadership training we practice it in role plays because it is like challenging. But then it's just the discipline to do it, to not kind of walk by the mess and but to say something about it. So that wasn't particularly articulate, but like the bottom line is just get over yourself and do it. I don't know.
No, I agree. And one of our last sessions around Thanksgiving time, we talked about gratitude in the workplace, right? And what I found throughout the conversation is we started to talk about gratitude the same way we talk about confrontation. So for some people, it's really, really hard to say thank you.
Yeah.
Good job. For whatever reason, however they were grown up, they grew up, whatever it is,
Yeah.
No,
it's like not, it's like not for the workplace, like, oh, I gotta be buttoned up in the workplace. It's like,
Yeah, no,
But
Shannon, to your point about, you know, making the friction go away, or really like making this stick is
yes.
a phrase that we use often. Like, one thing we challenge our executives to do is really think of themselves as having two jobs. So yeah, you're the CFO, you're the COO, you're the head of sales, but you're also the chief reminding officer. And all of you guys are the chief reminding officer for this stuff. And that can feel really scary. And when I teach our executives on how to think about this, I think the biggest miss for most leaders is they think about communication as this really formal thing, right? So communication is the town hall, it's the all hands, it's the email with the company letterhead and the headshot at the top, right? It's this like copywritten, formal, edited thing. And yeah, that's important. You want to get that right. If you're not doing that, you're making a mistake. But if you think about all the little opportunities you have to talk to your team, to recognize people, to coach people, just all the little collisions that Jimmy talked about. And if you made a bar chart of all the formal communication opportunities against all the informal communication opportunities, it's not even close.
That's a great point.
Right? Yeah. All these little bits and all these little opportunities to reinforce what it is that you're talking about, they're everywhere. Like, you have hundreds of them a day, but a lot of leaders haven't taken the time to say, okay, what am I really trying to reinforce? Right? And the guys at Instagram, when they kind of look back at their journey, and they did a lot of things right and wrong, but they said, sometimes we were wrong, but we were never confused.
Yeah.
Right? They got this reinforcement thing exactly right. So when we work with our leadership teams, we break this chief reminding officer thing down into 3 bits. And it's just like, hey, what are you going to recognize people on? What are you going to time out and coach people on when it happens? And what are you just going to say over and over and over again, so you can pass what we call the impression test? Like, if your team can do a believable impression of you saying this thing that relates to what you're trying to build, you're probably getting there, right?
Yeah.
So it can be a scary thing to try and, harness storytelling and, get people pumped up. But again, to go back to Dan Coyle stuff, like he says, it's way less about being inspiring. It's more about being consistent. And I think that starts with taking advantage of all these little but important informal communication opportunities that all of us have every single day.
Yeah. So yeah, the last thing I know, that it's just wrong when a manager or a leader says something like, well, so-and-so doesn't need positive reinforcement, or so-and-so's kind of got it together, so I just let them do their thing. Like, that is dereliction of duty as a manager. And like, from a neuroscience perspective, which is one of the reasons like dignity is a huge part of of the CultureIQ framework, like we crave belonging as a species. And like, part of belonging is like the positive reinforcement. I am a member of this tribe. And when actions are not in alignment with what the expectations are with the tribe, something needs to be said, or that new behavior becomes the new norm and becomes the new culture, right? So like, this is all hardwired into our brain, and we don't turn off the emotional side of our brain when we show up to work. It's there the whole time. Almost the same thing with like culture. Culture's there whether you focus on it or not. Like the like mammalian reptilian part of our emotional brain that the cerebral cortex is built on is there whether we address it or not. So it's just got to be something that managers do.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And again, if you're ignoring that positive feedback element, right, it's going to only be negative feedback. And
yeah,
what's that going to do to,
that who wants to stick our
we don't need positive feedback every day. But
yeah, and who worth their salt? Who worth their salt wants to stick around an organization where they don't hear anything? It's like, oh, go find a better job. Like, get out of here.
It's awesome. You leave only the hot. It's going to get too hot. You're not going to want to touch it.
Right.
Awesome. So, Paul, we haven't jumped into personal scouting reports at all. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, and I think the connection with what we're going to talk about here in a minute is, every culture is different. Every culture should be different. And every culture should be grounded in what's already good about your organization today. But there are some baseline things that research would tell you kind of matter and will put you ahead of the pack if you focus on them if your competitors don't, right? And whether you're talking about a team or a huge organization, this rule still holds. Like, psychological safety is one of those things. So if your team can't surface risks, if your team can't ask questions, if your team can't raise their hand for help when they're confused, they don't know how to do something, I don't even have to tell you what the drawbacks of those things are, but they're significant, right? So there's great studies out there. I love Google's work on Project Aristotle. If you haven't seen it, there's a fantastic New York Times article on it. They asked the question, what does it mean to be a high-performing team? And what's different about our teams that are crushing it inside of Google versus those that are really struggling? And they did a research study like they often do. And what they found was the factors that they thought were going to matter, team size, tenure, expertise, education, were not the most important thing. The most important factor that differentiated high-performing teams from low-performing teams was psychological safety, which is basically, this is a space that's safe for me to take risks, and I don't have to worry about the backlash from looking stupid, asking a question, disagreeing with what's going on, right? So, okay, you agree that
I belong. I am a member of this tribe. I belong.
Yes, exactly. And if you read anything by Amy Edmondson out of Harvard, she's got a great book called Teaming, which explores this in much more detail. But the question is, how do you build this, right? Like, okay, that sounds good, but how do you do psychological safety? And we've got different ways that we work on this with our teams, but we want to create spaces where executives can have open and passionate debates about the things that matter most, where they don't feel like they're being personally attacked, or they don't feel like they're losing status as a result. And so one of the tools that we use to do this is something called a personal scouting report. And all it is it's a guide to working with you. And I don't know if I'm allowed to share my screen, but I'm sharing my screen. We'll send this out to folks if they're interested in it. There's an article we wrote. There's a longer, slightly more boring article that we wrote on it. But
not boring, Paul. It's riveting. Riveting.
Rather than tell you what it is, I'll just show you mine, right? Like, this is the document that we use with our leadership teams inside our portfolio. This is the document that I use whenever I'm working with someone for the first time. And the whole goal of this, just like a scouting report in athletics prepares you to face the competition, it tells you who you're going to be on the field with so you can be more prepared, so you can play at your best. This isn't competitively framed. This is collaboratively framed. It tells you, oh, you're on my team. This is what you're good at. This is what you're saying yes to. This is what you love when people who work with you do. But there's also a vulnerable side. And that vulnerable side is what builds psychological safety. If I know that I can open up to you and I can say, hey, these are the things that put me on my back foot. This is what I'm like when I'm at my worst. And gasp, this is a tendency I might overuse, or that some people might even find annoying, God forbid. That's a different conversation than people who are just working with each other would normally get to in their first interaction, right? So one of the benefits of this is just speed. Like, hey, Jimmy and I have worked together for a long time. We know all this stuff about each other just as a result of all those collisions. But if you don't want to wait 6 to 12 months to figure out these preferences and figure out, hey, what are the ways that I can be vulnerable in front of Jimmy and what are the ways in which I have to be guarded? This fast tracks all of that by making it visible, by making it clear. And it's also just a really fun exercise. So, yeah. I'll share the article with folks. This is something that we do at pretty much every leadership offsite in the first year of an investment. And people come away with it, and they usually share it with the rest of their teams. And they say, hey, yeah, I would have gotten there, but it would have taken me a year to figure this stuff out about the people that I work with.
Yeah. And yeah, the thing I would, what's just like leadership and culture are kind of two sides of the same coin. You can't do one without the other. Psychological safety and vulnerability are two sides of the same coin, if not synonymous. You can't do one without the other. And like, Paul can absolutely, like, Paul always has an opinion and he states it firmly, and he's very smart, and that can be intimidating. And sometimes, especially early on in our working relationship, I would hold back some of my thoughts before sharing them because I need to get things tied up before I talk to Paul. Like, once he and I got to know each other, I don't do that at all anymore. And it's because I know his quirks and I know how he operates. But like you said, this speeds that up. And like, think about anyone who's risen to the level of CEO or CFO. They tend to, be pretty smart. They tend to be pretty direct. And you can imagine some folks around them might be resident to like say what they really think, right? And this is a way to break down those barriers a little bit. And guess what? If your executive team does it, what permission structure does that create for the rest of the organization? So yeah, we use it inside Parker Gale. A lot of our portfolio companies use it. It's a great way to speed up.
CultureIQ used it, and I did it.
Nice.
It was a fun team exercise. I will admit that it dug up some demons, a lot of self-reflection.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things, I noticed some things like that are my strong suit that are simultaneously things that inhibit me sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Some things can go like a little too far. Also, like one direct thing, and it was very simple, but one of the things that I think I said was either annoying or something I didn't exactly like in the workplace was when you give me a task without a deadline, right? I can't tell you how quickly everyone's behavior changed after that.
Right.
Yeah.
They would have figured it out, but it would have taken years, right? Yeah.
Content piece or something, some edit somewhere. I had a deadline. And even if it was 30 minutes or, I have a week, I got one. And that was all that mattered, So it does work, I have to admit.
And it's a minor thing.
Asking for help easier, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a minor thing, but like that's how issues on teams fester. It doesn't. No issues start as big issues. No. They start as really minor things, and it's like it's like I may have a standard that you never show up late to meetings, but if I never like communicate that, it's like I show up 5 minutes late, 3 times in a row, and I go from being a reliable team member to being someone who slacks off and always shows up late, right? But like I have no idea because my personality is to like be working right up until like the meeting starts, and like those are the things that cause distress in teams, not just teams at the lower, but executive teams. That's how big problems happen, and we see it all the time.
I couldn't agree more. One of my former bosses, she said, elephants don't bite, gnats do.
Wait, say it again. Elephants don't bite. What does?
But gnats do.
Oh yeah, exactly. There you go.
That's biologically accurate and insightful, which are my favorite type of facts.
It should rhyme. It needs to rhyme, and then it'll really.
I'll work on it. All right, guys. So we've had a great conversation today, and I'm really grateful for your time. I just want to end on a couple more questions for you. So since I have you here, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. So everything we talk about today, right? How does this affect our bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, I think I covered it earlier, but like the costs of getting this wrong are pretty significant. And I think it's scarier because they show up slowly but meaningfully, right? Like you're going to look behind you if you forget to focus on this stuff in the right way a year or two from now. It's going to take a while, but people are not going to be productive. You're going to lose people that you didn't want to lose. You're going to have fumbled some customer communications or interactions that you wouldn't have otherwise fumbled. And I'd say the cost of getting this wrong, it's a bunch of tiny but very noticeable things, right? And that's the way to think about it. And I think the scarier part is it can be tough to measure, which makes it easy to ignore. But that's the biggest danger, is ignoring it.
Yeah, the one word I would say, it's when cultures are strong, you as an organization have a tremendous amount of agility, right? Which is no coincidence. That's a powerful piece of the CultureIQ framework. And what that means to me as an operating principle inside a private equity firm is there is a lot thrown at everyone that works at a private equity owned business, because there's the customer stuff, there's developing things fast, there's all the things that happen in the world, in the global community. There is us as investors putting pressure on results, and if you don't have a culture that can adapt quickly, look around corners, you're going to do all the small things that Paul was describing, the death by 1,000 cuts. And yeah, it's a little bit invisible, but it's invisible when you're looking at a P&L, but it is absolutely measurable. And that's where you guys come in.
Absolutely. All right. Last question. It's a fun question. I think we've referenced about 50 books on these 45 minutes.
Yeah.
All right. Give me
with us.
Favorite all-time book and the last book you read.
Is this just culturally related books we're talking about right now, or just
preferably? But I mean, if you got like a nonfiction book you want to throw out.
I mean, the advantage is sort of my Bible for how you build a healthy culture, how you build a healthy organization. Like I mentioned, we're grateful to work with the Table Group, and they're an important partner for us in our portfolio. So that's probably my most gifted book, period. And I steal with pride from it all the time. That's how I do about a third of my job. I'm making my way through, I think it's Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses S. Grant right now. It's a long book. It's taken me a while, but it's just a great profile of somebody who turned out to be an amazing leader in a very authentic way and kind of changed the course of history. And it's amazingly well researched, but I need to finish that one soon because it's taken me a while to get through, but it's a good one.
Nice. I'll say that, so Daniel Coyle, Culture Code, but I'll add another one with the Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. I actually think I think all managers and leaders need to understand psychology in some way. And the way he talks about the mind and System 1 and System 2 was very powerful for how I think about change and culture and how I conduct myself. My favorite book of 2020 was The $1 Trillion Coach. It was about Bill Campbell, who was the executive coach of Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt, and worked really closely with the Google founders and a number of other Silicon Valley folks. And posthumously, Eric Schmidt kind of corralled a bunch of those leaders to write the story of who he was. And my most salient memory from that book was, Bill thought about the fundamental unit of a company, not as an individual performer, but as a team, which I thought was really insightful, because it is true. None of us do anything on our own. I can do nothing by myself. I am only productive in the context of the team. So that's how Bill did all of his coaching, which I thought was really profound. So $1 Trillion Coach. Great.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you again, guys. If you want to hear more from Paul and Jimmy, they have a podcast. You guys want to talk about your podcast real quick?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Private Equity Funcast, Parker Gale podcast. Yeah. Subscribe. And yeah, you hear from me and Paul and then other members of the Parker Gale crew. We have guests. And I think you all, the CultureIQ team is going to join at some point in early 2021. So we're working on that.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and if you want to steal a little bit of our thinking on this stuff, we have an episode that talks about this from a while back. We need to do a refresh, but it's called How We Think About People, Ops, and Culture. And it's, occasionally on topic, but always entertaining. And, we eventually get through our opening banter. So I hope you guys enjoy that.
Yeah. If you don't want to hear about us, fast forward through the first 15 minutes. Yeah, we do need to do a refresh of that one and point out all the things we got wrong. That would be fun.
Yeah, if Paul's on, usually the first 10 is about lacrosse. So just
it's optional. First 10 is optional.
Awesome. All right. Thank you again, guys. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. We'll be here usually on Fridays at 1. And if you would like to submit any questions in advance, you can submit them to CultureLaunch@cultureiq.com. Thanks again. Have a great weekend. Take care, guys.
Yeah. Thanks.